Ethan Cole pushed open the door to his mother's hospital room, carrying a bouquet of white lilies, and what he saw, in that split second, shattered everything he thought he knew about love. He wasn't supposed to arrive this early. Evelyn had been in the hospital for 2 days. A sudden collapse during morning prayers, the doctor said. Serious, but treatable. Ethan had sat beside her that morning, held her fragile hand, promised he'd return after closing a business deal across town. His fiancée, Camilla, had insisted on staying with her while he worked. Go take care of business, Camilla had said, kissing his cheek. Let me bond with my future mother-in-law. I'll watch over her. He believed her. So when Ethan's meeting ended earlier than expected, and he decided to surprise them both with Evelyn's favorite flowers, he walked into St. Luke's Medical Center with nothing but peace in his heart. The critical care unit was unusually still that afternoon. Soft light filtered through the corridor windows, casting everything in an almost sacred glow. He nodded at a nurse passing by, adjusted his grip on the lilies, and headed toward room 307. That's when he heard it. A sharp, frantic beeping, the muffled sound of struggle, something that made his spirit recoil before his mind could process why. Ethan's hand hit the door, shoving it open, and the world stopped. Camilla stood over his mother's bed, both hands locked around a pillow, pressing it down with brutal force over Evelyn's face. His mother's thin fingers clawed desperately at Camilla's wrists, her small body writhing beneath the hospital sheets, fighting for oxygen that wouldn't come. And Camilla's face, God help him, her face was twisted into something he'd never seen before. Not the woman who laughed at his jokes or whispered, I love you in the dark. This was rage. This was calculated. This was a stranger wearing his fiancée's skin. The lilies hit the floor. What are you doing? The words tore from his throat, like a prayer and a scream at once. Camilla's head whipped toward him. The pillow dropped. Evelyn's chest convulsed as she sucked in ragged, desperate gasps. Sounds so raw and broken they would play in Ethan's nightmares for years to come. For one impossible second, Ethan couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't reconcile the elegant woman in the red dress, the woman who'd chosen her wedding dress with his mother just last month, with the woman who'd just tried to murder her. This was Camilla Hart, the woman who'd swept into his life at a charity gala, the woman who'd said yes when he proposed on a beach in Santorini, the woman who was supposed to become Mrs. Cole in 3 months. But the woman staring back at him now, eyes wild with panic, hands trembling, chest heaving, was someone he'd never met. And in that moment, as machines screamed and his mother gasped for life, and Camilla's mouth opened to form some excuse he knew would be a lie, Ethan realized something that would change everything. The woman he'd been planning to spend forever with was a complete stranger. And his mother, the woman who'd prayed over him every day of his life, who'd whispered just that morning, Son, I've been asking God to show you the truth, even if it hurts, had almost been silenced forever. But before we dive deeper into this nightmare, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Because sometimes, God answers prayers in the most terrifying ways, revealing darkness just seconds before it destroys everything we love. The story really begins 3 days earlier, when Evelyn Cole knelt in her home chapel at dawn, hands folded, voice trembling as she prayed the most dangerous prayer a mother can pray. Remove every hidden danger from my son's life, even if the truth destroys what he thinks is love. She didn't know that moments later, she would collapse. She didn't know her prayer would be answered in the most horrifying way possible. And she certainly didn't know that the woman her son was about to marry had been planning this moment for months. But right now, in room 307, none of that history mattered. The only thing that mattered was what happened in the next 3 seconds. Ethan lunged forward, instinct overriding shock. His hands closed around Camilla's shoulders, and he yanked her backward with a force that sent her stumbling into the monitoring equipment. The pillow fell to the floor. Evelyn's body convulsed as she dragged air into her lungs, each breath a desperate, rattling gasp that sounded like tearing paper. Her face was flushed deep red, bruises already forming around her mouth where the pillow had crushed against her skin. Her eyes, wide and terrified, found her son's face, and something in them broke him. Fear, relief, and something else. Something that looked almost like I tried to warn you. Ethan, wait. Camilla's voice cracked as she caught her balance against the wall. It's not what you think. I was helping her. She moved toward him, hands outstretched, tears already streaming down her perfectly made-up face. She couldn't breathe. I was trying to help her breathe. You have to believe me. But Ethan wasn't listening to her words. He was watching her body, the way her jaw clenched and unclenched, the way her hands wouldn't stop shaking, fingers curling and uncurling like she was still gripping something, the way her eyes darted between him and the door, calculating, measuring her chances. This wasn't the face of someone who'd just tried to save a life. This was the face of someone who'd been caught, step away from her. His voice came out cold, unrecognizable even to himself. The door burst open. 2 nurses rushed in, followed by a doctor Ethan vaguely remembered from that morning. They stopped short, taking in the scene. Evelyn fighting for breath. Ethan standing between his mother and his fiancée like a human shield. Camilla pressed against the wall, mascara running, red dress wrinkled. The pillow on the floor. What happened here? The older nurse moved immediately to Evelyn's side, checking her vitals, examining the fresh bruising around her mouth and nose. She attacked me. Camilla's voice rose, shrill and desperate. Mrs. Cole woke up confused and violent. She grabbed my hair, tried to pull me down. I was defending myself. Tell them, Ethan, tell them your mother hasn't been herself. The younger nurse's eyes widened as she noticed the marks on Evelyn's face. Doctor, these bruises, they're consistent with pressure. Significant pressure. I need security in room 307. Now. The doctor's voice was calm but firm as he pressed the call button. Ethan knelt beside his mother's bed, taking her trembling hand. It felt so small, so fragile, like holding a bird with a broken wing. Mom. Mom. Can you hear me? Evelyn's lips moved, forming words that barely made sound. He leaned closer. Son, she whispered, her voice like wind through dead leaves. God showed me something dark in her. I felt it. In my spirit, I felt it. Her fingers tightened around his, with surprising strength. Pray with me, please. Something in Ethan's chest cracked wide open. His mother had known. Somehow, she'd known. All those times she'd smiled politely at Camilla. All those quiet moments when she'd looked at him with concern in her eyes and said nothing. She'd been praying. Praying for God to reveal what she couldn't prove. And her prayer had been answered in the most terrifying way possible. 2 security guards entered, their presence making the small room feel even more claustrophobic. Someone want to explain what's going on? The taller guard looked between Ethan and Camilla. This is insane. Camilla pushed off the wall, her composure cracking further. You're all acting like I did something wrong. She was going to ruin everything. She wanted to turn you against me, Ethan. She never thought I was good enough for you. The room went silent. Even Camilla seemed to realize what she'd just said, her hand flying to her mouth too late to catch the words already hanging in the air like poison. She was going to ruin everything? Ethan repeated slowly, standing. Ruin what, Camilla? Her eyes went wide. That's not. I didn't mean. Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us. The security guard stepped forward. Hospital administration will want to review what happened here. No, Ethan, tell them. Tell them I would never. But her protests sounded hollow now, desperate in a way that confirmed every horrible suspicion forming in Ethan's mind. As the guards escorted Camilla toward the door, she twisted back to look at him one more time, the woman he'd proposed to on a beach in Santorini, the woman who'd cried when he slipped the ring on her finger, the woman who'd convinced him that love at first sight was real. Ethan, please, I love you. You know I love you. But he didn't know that. Standing there in the sterile light of that hospital room, watching nurses document his mother's injuries, Listening to his mother's labored breathing, Ethan realized he didn't know anything about the woman being led away in handcuffs. He'd known a performance, a carefully constructed illusion. But the real Camilla Hart? She was a complete stranger. The door closed. The room emptied until it was just Ethan and his mother, and the steady beeping of machines that had almost flatlined. He sank into the chair beside her bed and let his head fall into his hands. The weight of what had almost happened, what he'd almost lost, what he'd almost married, crashed over him like a wave he couldn't fight. "Father," he whispered into his palms, voice breaking. "Show me what I couldn't see. Show me who she really is. Show me how I missed this." Hot tears leaked between his fingers. How did I miss this? Down the hallway, Camilla sat in a security office, her story already changing for the third time. While hospital administrators pulled surveillance footage and nurses compared notes on the injuries they'd documented, the mask she'd worn so carefully for 8 months was cracking, piece by piece, and there would be no putting it back together. The truth, sharp and merciless and devastating, was finally clawing its way into the light. And Ethan Cole, billionaire, philanthropist, man who'd built an empire on reading people and making calculated decisions, would have to face the most humiliating question of his life. How had he gotten so close to marrying his mother's murderer? Detective Sarah Chen arrived at Street Luke's medical center 47 minutes after security called it in. She'd been investigating financial crimes for 12 years, and she'd learned to trust her instincts. The moment she watched the surveillance footage from room 307, those instincts started screaming. This wasn't a confused woman trying to help. This was attempted murder, premeditated and deliberate. And in her experience, when someone tried to kill for money, there was always a trail. She started digging. What she found made her stomach turn. Camilla Hart wasn't who she claimed to be. The prestigious marketing executive position at a Manhattan firm, fabricated. The apartment in Tribeca, 2 months behind on rent with an eviction notice dated 3 weeks ago. The sophisticated art collector backstory? A carefully constructed lie, built from stolen Instagram photos and memorized talking points. But it got worse. Bank records showed gambling debts, totaling over $300,000, spread across 4 casinos in Atlantic City. Text messages from loan sharks, with increasingly violent threats. Phone records showing calls to bankruptcy lawyers, debt consolidation services, and, in one chilling instance, a dark web forum discussing ways to fake accidental deaths. Detective Chen pulled up Camilla's search history from her seized laptop. Her jaw tightened as she scrolled through months of calculated research. Ethan Cole net worth, Ethan Cole mother health conditions, Ethan Cole charitable foundation calendar, how to meet billionaires, signs someone will propose, average engagement length for wealthy men, Evelyn Cole medical history, Evelyn Cole church schedule, and then, in the weeks leading up to the collapse, searches that made Chen's blood run cold. Symptoms of natural death in elderly patients. How long can someone survive without oxygen? Do hospital rooms have cameras? This wasn't a relationship. This was a hunting strategy. "Mr. Cole, I think you need to see this." Detective Chen sat across from Ethan in a private conference room the hospital had provided. She slid a folder across the table. "We've been investigating Miss Hart's background. It's not what she told you." Ethan's hand shook as he opened the folder. Each page felt like another betrayal, another lie he'd swallowed whole. They'd met at a charity gala 16 months ago. She'd spilled champagne on his jacket, apologized with a laugh that sounded like music, and he'd thought it was fate. Serendipity. Divine timing. Now he was reading communication logs, showing she'd purchased a ticket to that gala specifically because she knew he'd be there. She'd researched his favorite champagne. She'd positioned herself in his path. She'd engineered their entire love story like a con artist running a long game. Her friends knew. Chen continued gently. "We found text messages. They called you the golden ticket. She told them marrying you would solve everything. That she just had to get past your mother's approval." Ethan stared at a screenshot of a message Camilla had sent 3 months ago. "Old lady won't last forever. Ethan worships her, but she's fragile. Once I'm Mrs. Cole, I'll be untouchable. Just have to play the devoted daughter-in-law role a little longer. He thought he might be sick. In the interrogation room down the hall, Camilla was unraveling. The composed, elegant woman who charmed Manhattan's social elite was gone, replaced by someone desperate and cornered and dangerous. Her lawyer sat beside her, repeatedly advising her to stop talking. But Camilla couldn't seem to help herself. The dam had broken. I loved him. She slammed her hands on the table, mascara running in black rivers down her face. I did love him. You don't understand what it's like to have nothing, to watch everyone around you living these perfect lives while you're drowning. She sucked in a ragged breath. Evelyn was in the way. She kept looking at me like she knew, like she could see through me. I couldn't let her turn Ethan against me. I couldn't lose everything when I was so close. So you decided to kill her? Detective Chen's voice was flat. I thought if she was gone, Ethan would need me more. Grief makes people desperate for comfort. I could have been that for him. We could have been happy. The marriage would have saved everything. It would have saved me. You weren't trying to save a relationship, Miss Hart. You were trying to save yourself from loan sharks and bankruptcy by murdering an innocent woman. Camilla's face crumpled. I never meant to hurt anyone. I just needed a way out. But she had meant it. The searches proved it. The planning proved it. The pillow pressed over Evelyn Cole's face until her body stopped fighting proved it. Camilla Hart had meant every calculated, cold-blooded second of it. Ethan found himself in the hospital chapel an hour later, still clutching the folder of evidence. The small room smelled like candle wax and old wood. Stained glass filtered afternoon light into pools of blue and gold across empty pews. He collapsed onto a bench in the back and finally let himself break. His shoulders shook with sobs he'd been holding back since he'd walked into room 307. He'd been so blind, so stupidly, arrogantly blind. God, he choked out between gasps. Why didn't I see it? Why did you let me get so close to marrying that? Why couldn't I see what my mother saw? Sometimes we can't see what we're not ready to know. The chaplain's voice was soft. An elderly man with kind eyes stood in the doorway. May I? Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. The chaplain sat beside him, giving him space to grieve. Your mother is a praying woman, the chaplain said after a long silence. She's been in this chapel before. Praying for you. Praying for truth to be revealed. Sometimes God answers prayers by exposing what we refuse to see on our own. It's painful, but it's merciful. Because exposure, even when it hurts, is always better than deception that kills. Later that evening, when Evelyn was strong enough to sit up, Ethan held her hand and asked the question that had been haunting him. Mom, why didn't you tell me? If you sensed something was wrong, why didn't you just say it? Her eyes filled with tears. Because I was afraid, son. Afraid you'd think I was jealous. Afraid you'd choose her over me. Afraid I was wrong. Her voice cracked. So I prayed instead. I asked God to show you the truth, even if it destroyed what you thought was love. I asked him to protect you, even if the answer broke your heart. She squeezed his hand. I just wanted you safe. That's all I've ever wanted. Ethan looked at his mother, really looked at her. At the bruises still darkening her face. At the strength in her eyes despite her fragile body. At the woman who'd loved him enough to pray a dangerous prayer and trust God with the consequences. If he'd arrived 5 minutes later, she'd be dead. If his meeting had run long, if he'd decided not to bring flowers, if any single variable had shifted, he'd have lost her forever, and married her killer 3 months later. It was divine intervention, he whispered. Wasn't it? Evelyn smiled through her tears. Sometimes, God's protection looks like perfect timing. You were exactly where you needed to be. Exactly when you needed to be there. Not a second too late. Down the hall, Detective Chen was preparing arrest warrants. Attempted murder, fraud, conspiracy. The charges were stacking up, and Camilla Hart's carefully constructed world was burning to ash. But in the chapel, and later in room 307, something else was happening. A man was learning to trust the warnings his spirit had been too proud to hear. A mother's prayers were being answered in the most terrifying, miraculous way possible. And the truth, finally free from the prison of a beautiful lie, was beginning its painful work of healing. The arrest happened on a cold Thursday morning, 5 days after Evelyn Cole's prayer had been answered in the most horrifying way possible. Camilla sat in the hospital's security office, her red dress now wrinkled and stained, her makeup long since cried away, when Detective Chen entered with 2 uniformed officers and a warrant bearing her full legal name, Camilla Marie Hartwell. Camilla Hartwell, you're under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Chen's voice was steady, professional, but her eyes held something harder. Disgust, maybe, or pity for what desperation had turned this woman into. The handcuffs clicked into place, and something inside Camilla finally shattered completely. Ethan! Her scream echoed down the hospital corridor as they led her toward the exit. Ethan! Please! I did this for us. For our future. Everything I did was for us. Her voice climbed higher, more desperate, as they passed room 307. She knew he was in there. She could feel him refusing to come out, refusing to look at her one last time. You don't understand. Your mother was going to ruin everything. She never wanted us to be happy. Detective Chen tightened her grip on Camilla's arm. Ma'am, you need to stop talking. But Camilla couldn't stop. The dam had broken, and everything was pouring out. Ugly and raw and true. It's not fair. None of this is fair. People like Evelyn Cole. People like you, Ethan. You don't know what it's like to have nothing. Society tells us we're supposed to want these lives, and then punishes us for doing whatever it takes to get them. The system is broken. I'm a victim too. She was still screaming as they pushed through the hospital doors into the pale morning light. Still screaming as they guided her into the back of a police car. Still screaming Ethan's name, like it was a lifeline that might pull her back from the edge of the cliff she'd already jumped off. But inside room 307, Ethan stood with his back pressed against the wall, eyes closed, listening to the woman he'd almost married blame everyone but herself for the choices that had brought her here. He'd watched from the window as they'd walked her down the corridor, watched her thrash against the handcuffs, watched her turn back one last time, her eyes finding his through the small window in the door. She'd mouthed the words, "Save me," and something in her expression had almost broken him. Because beneath the desperation and the manipulation and the lies, there was still a flicker of the woman he'd thought he loved. Or maybe there wasn't. Maybe that woman had never existed at all. When she'd begged him to help her, to use his money and his lawyers and his influence to make this all go away, he'd done the hardest thing he'd ever done in his life. He'd turned away, chosen truth over the comfortable lie, chosen his mother's life over a love that had never been real. His heart was breaking, but it was the kind of breaking that lets light in, the kind that heals even as it hurts. 3 weeks later, Evelyn sat in the chair beside her hospital bed, color returning to her cheeks, strength returning to her voice. The bruises had faded from her face, but the memory of what had almost happened remained sharp. Ethan visited every day, bringing her flowers, reading to her, praying with her. Their bond, already strong, had been forged into something unbreakable in the fire of almost losing each other. "You know what keeps running through my mind?" Evelyn said one afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the window. "That scripture. What the enemy meant for evil, God turned for good. That's what happened here, son. The enemy sent someone to destroy you, to destroy us. But God turned it into revelation, into protection, into a testimony of his faithfulness." Ethan nodded, throat tight. He'd been struggling with guilt and shame since Camilla's arrest. Guilt that he'd been so blind. Shame that he'd ignored every warning his spirit had tried to give him. Shame that his mother had almost died because he'd chosen to trust a beautiful face over the discernment he'd been raised to value. "I should have listened to you," he said quietly. I should have seen what you saw. Baby, you saw what she wanted you to see. These kinds of people, they're professional deceivers. They study you. They become exactly what you're looking for. That's not your failure. That's spiritual warfare. She reached for his hand, but now you know. Now you understand that not everyone who smiles at you loves you. Not everyone who says the right words means them. Some people wear love like a costume, and the only way to see through it is to stay connected to God and trust the people who've been praying for you since before you were born. In the weeks that followed, Ethan threw himself into the charitable foundations his mother had spent her life building. Programs for at-risk youth, shelters for women escaping domestic violence, recovery centers for gambling addiction. He sat with people who'd lost everything to desperation and lies, and he started to understand the path that had led Camilla to his mother's hospital bed. Understanding didn't excuse it, but it helped him process the rage and betrayal that still woke him up at 3 a.m. some nights. He learned to recognize the spiritual warnings he'd ignored. The way his mother had gone quiet whenever Camilla entered a room, the way certain friends had raised eyebrows when he'd announced the engagement, the way his own spirit had whispered, "Too fast, too perfect, too convenient," before he'd silenced it with rationalizations about fate and destiny. He'd wanted love so badly that he'd ignored every red flag waving in his face. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Camilla's trial came swiftly. The evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance footage, search history, text messages, testimony from loan sharks and casino managers. A paper trail of lies that stretched back years before she'd ever met Ethan Cole. Her lawyer tried to argue diminished capacity, financial desperation, mental health struggles. But you couldn't diminish capacity your way out of months of premeditation. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Attempted murder in the first degree. She was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security facility, with possibility of parole after 10. As they led her away, she turned one last time to where Ethan sat in the gallery. He met her eyes, but his expression held nothing she could use anymore. No love, no hate, just a profound sadness for what she'd chosen to become. 6 months after the arrest, Ethan and Evelyn stood together in their family church, the same sanctuary where Evelyn had prayed every Sunday for 40 years. Evening light filtered through stained glass, painting the pews in shades of amber and gold. They approached the altar together and lit 2 white candles, one for protection, one for thanksgiving. Ethan stared at the flame dancing in the dim sanctuary and thought about how close he'd come to losing everything. 5 minutes. That's all that had stood between his mother's life and death. 5 minutes that felt like the hand of God reaching down to say, "Not yet, not like this, not on my watch." Evelyn stood beside him, her hand finding his in the flickering light. Her voice was soft but strong when she spoke. "Some storms come to destroy, son. They come with wind and fury, and they tear everything down. But other storms come to reveal, to expose what was hidden, to show us what we couldn't see in the sunshine." This was a revealing storm. Painful, terrifying, but ultimately merciful. Ethan felt tears slide down his face as he stared at the candles, burning steady against the darkness. He thought about Camilla sitting in a prison cell, about the life she'd destroyed trying to steal his, about the love he'd thought was real that had only ever been a transaction. He thought about his mother's prayers, about divine timing, about the way God had orchestrated his early arrival at the hospital with precision that still took his breath away. He looked up at the cross, hanging above the altar, and for the first time since he'd pushed open that hospital room door, he felt something other than pain. He felt gratitude, deep, overwhelming, humbling gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered into the sacred silence. "Thank you for saving us. Thank you for answering her prayers even when it hurt. Thank you for loving us enough to expose the darkness before it destroyed us. Thank you for perfect timing. Thank you for truth, even when truth breaks our hearts." Beside him, Evelyn squeezed his hand and whispered her own prayer of thanksgiving. The candles burned on. Outside, the world continued spinning, indifferent and chaotic and beautiful. But inside that sanctuary, a mother and son stood in the presence of the God who'd heard a desperate prayer at dawn and answered it with a miracle disguised as a nightmare. And in the answering, had saved them both.